Yes. Can everybody hear me at the back? Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for coming here. Thank you very much for the very kind introduction. And thank you very much for the invitation. I feel very honored to be here and introduce you to my research here this afternoon. So I will be speaking about the topic of how to handle a mummy. Well, when I was still a graduate student, I came across an old catalogue of Egyptian papyri that are kept in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. As I was flipping through the photographic plates, I noticed this remarkable manuscript, 2 sheets of papyrus side to side, inscribed in careless cursive Egyptian, in narrow, wobbly columns in black ink. At first sight, maybe not that appealing, and many of my colleagues would agree with you. But I was intrigued nonetheless, because the manuscript is inscribed in 2 forms of Egyptian cursive, and those who are familiar with Egyptian might notice. Oh, here. This is all hieratic, and this is demotic. In ancient Egypt, so you have 2 forms, the more formal hieratic script and the vernacular demotic script. In ancient Egypt, these script varieties were usually kept apart. The hieratic script was used for writing all age-old formal text in the archaic classical language. And the demotic script was used for writing day-to-day documents and contemporary compositions in the vernacular language. Why would these 2 writing systems be used side by side in this manuscript? I asked myself. I decided then to pursue this question. But first I had to finish a dissertation on an unrelated topic, so I had to shelve the project for a few years. And when I came back to it, a few years later, I did not realize that I was embarking on a long, long journey following a winding road with many dead ends and detours. Today I would like to share with you the results of my research, part of which was conducted here at the Institute for Advanced Study. And therefore I really thank the Institute's faculty and staff for their support. I also thank my fellow members for the many inspiring conversations, and I thank the friends of the Institute for the invitation to speak to you today. So let's start at the beginning. In 1886, Ernst Ritter von Bergman published a photographic plate of the papyrus as part of a catalogue of Egyptian papyri kept in the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. He transcribed most of the hieratic cursive lines into hieroglyphs, that's a common thing in Egyptology, but he gave no translation. He labeled the manuscript loosely as a Götterliste, so a list of gods, and left it at that, and was basically hinting to the reader, I don't know what to do with this thing. Almost 30 years later, the great demotic scholar Wilhelm Spiegelberg translated the demotic texts in a short article. He concluded correctly that the manuscript preserves incantations for a funerary ritual that is to be performed for a woman with the Greek name Artemis. Given this Greek name and the forms of the handwriting, he dated the manuscript to the Hellenistic period, say 300 to 100 before the Common Era, a period when Egypt was ruled by Greek kings and that witnessed cultural interaction between the Egyptians and the Greeks. Well, ever since this article of 1914, the manuscript has received little attention. Where to go from here? Let's take another close look at the manuscript. The manuscript consists, in fact, of 2 loose sheets of papyrus that were framed together under glass in the 19th century, and that is how it still is today in the museum if you go there. And what Ritter von Bergman and Spiegelberg failed to observe, and what I myself also failed to observe for the longest time, is that the 2 sheets of the manuscript join directly. The right margin of the left sheet is slightly lighter in color than the rest of the manuscript. I hope you can see that even on this photo, which is not perfect, but this is clearly lighter in color than the rest of the sheet. This is the adhesive edge upon which the left edge of the right sheet was pasted when it was still a scroll. But with the help of Photoshop, we with little effort, restore the manuscript by digitally pasting the right sheet onto the adhesive edge of the left sheet. So let's do that. And there we go. This restoration is of major significance because it establishes the correct sequence of incantations. So now we know that we have to read them from here to here, which wasn't even clear before that. And you can, of course, imagine the eureka moment I had when I did this. Furthermore, it allows us to read the name of the mother of this Artemis. As you can see here in the yellow box, there are 2 lines of text running from the right sheet onto the left sheet. And take a closer look. One of these lines contains the affiliation formula. And it says, the Hathor of Artemis, born of Hierais. Hathor, that is a funerary epithet given to women who are dead and will go on to the afterlife. So Artemis, born of Hierais. Hierais, of course, is also a Greek name. And so the hand, as you can see here, is by no means beautiful, but it is, we can clearly make it out. The Hathor of Artemis, born of Hierais. The funerary epithet Hathor, notice, is written in hieratic. That is the prestigious religious title, whereas the Greek names are spelled in alphabetic demotic signs. Well, this identification reminded me of a summary description by Théodule de Veria in his 1872 Catalogue of Egyptian Papyri in the Louvre Museum in Paris. I just give you the quote. And he says there that one of the papyri is ascribed to the Hathor Artemis born of Nirais. Well, as the name Nirais does not exist, I suspected that de Veria misread the name Hierais and that his Louvre manuscript was inscribed for the same Artemis born of Hierais as the Vienna manuscript. And those who know Demotic will give some credit to de Veria because the H and the N, they're kind of similar. And this proved to be correct upon inspection. This is the Louvre manuscript, and the names of the deceased and her mother occur throughout. And I hope you will see this is also the same hand as the Vienna manuscript. So we have to conclude the Louvre and the Vienna manuscript were inscribed by the same scribe for the same individual. It is obvious that the Louvre and Vienna sheets once formed part of one and the same papyrus scroll. Do we now have the complete scroll? As I will show you in a minute, the Louvre sheet preserves the title. It therefore formed the beginning of the scroll. As Egyptian is written from right to left, it formed the right end of the scroll. The Vienna sheet preserves the final episode of the ritual. It formed thus the right end of the scroll. If the two join, then we have the complete scroll. Well, let's take a look. There we go again. It goes a little too far, but unfortunately, there are ink traces at the right edge of the Vienna sheet, and those do not match the text on the left column of the Louvre sheet. And so we will have to conclude that the middle part is still missing. And where could it be? Because, of course, when you roll up a papyrus scroll, the middle part is protected against damage. And so if you have the beginning and you have the end, which does show the damage, because it was on the outside of the scroll, the middle must have been there when it was discovered in the 19th century. Where is it? Well, it follows from the summary records in the Vienna Museum that the manuscript must have been found by Antonio Lebolo around 1820 in Luxor in the south of Egypt. At that time, Lebolo worked as an agent for Bernardino Drovetti, the famous, maybe I should say infamous, French consul to Egypt and collector of Egyptian antiquities, whose collections would eventually form the backbone of the museums in Turin, the Louvre, the British Museum, etc. And Drovetti is here, which is beautiful, a head of fantasy head of an Egyptian pharaoh, and here is Lebolo. There are beautiful stories about this Lebolo, but he was a bit of a bully, but I can't go in there. He's, by the way, also the one who found the Smith papyri that the Mormon Church claims to be the Book of Abraham. So far, My archival research, which I just simply summarize here for you, has been unsuccessful. I've been to these museums, I looked into their storage rooms, but no middle part of my manuscript. So if anybody in this audience today has seen the missing piece, please see me after the talk. Well, let's work with what we have. This is what we have. What is this manuscript about? As Wilhelm Spiegelberg had already concluded on the basis of the Vienna sheet alone, we are dealing with the transcript of a funerary ritual. I therefore call the manuscript the Artemis liturgical papyrus, after the woman for whom the scroll was inscribed, Artemis, the daughter of Heraeus. Nothing is otherwise known about this woman. Judging from the handwriting, she must have lived and died in the late Hellenistic or early Roman period, say 100 before the Common Era, maybe to 100 after the Common Era. Her Greek name suggests that she presented herself in life as Greek. She probably wore a Greek dress and donned a Greek hairstyle. She may in fact have looked something like this. She must have belonged to the class of Greco-Egyptian provincial elites who served the Greek and Roman administration while at the same time participating in Egyptian cultural life. The papyrus attests that she was buried as an Egyptian. The ritual is totally Egyptian. Upon her death, she was mummified and buried with an Egyptian funerary papyrus. To my knowledge, her mummy has not been preserved, or other funerary equipment for that matter. Today, we have 8 columns of what was once a longer manuscript. And I don't know how much longer the manuscript actually was. I hope that you will agree with me at the end of my lecture that there's not that much missing. So maybe it's really only 1 sheet that is missing. And so just maybe maximum 2 columns. The first column preserves the opening heading or the title to the manuscript in vernacular demotic. And that is here, written above these 2 narrow columns. Let's take a closer look. And it says, the procedures that should be executed on the 35th day in the mummification hall of Apis Osiris in accordance with what is written in the ceremony of navigating the mummy, which is, and then the ink is so abraded that it is impossible to read. There's one phrase missing, which is, I don't even know what to put there. I have no idea what it's supposed to be. Well, there are here 4 salient features. First, the opening heading clearly states that the manuscript preserves the script for a ritual, which it calls here procedures. This ritual is obviously funerary in nature, as it is to be performed in a mummification hall. Moreover, it is specified that the ritual is to be carried out on the 35th day. The heading does not explicate what the significance of the 35th day is. But we know from other sources that the 35th day marked an important moment in the process of mummification. For example, we learn from this literary description, from a contemporary, a narrative that's more or less contemporary with the Artemis papyrus, we learn from this description of an ideal burial that the corpse was brought to the mummification hall 16 days after death. So in these 16 days, the family said goodbye to the body, it was washed, and then it was brought to the mummification hall. The corpse was then mummified and eventually buried on day 70. And indeed, we also know that from Greek historians, in ancient Egypt, mummification lasted ideally 70 days. This has to do with the stars, but we can discuss in the Q&A. Well, the 35th day is of course then halfway in the 70-day period of the mummification process. And as the passage states, ceremonies were conducted to mark this important moment. What those ceremonies were and what their significance was remains in this short description unexplained. Another text, however, states that it is on this day that the living Ba, or the spirit of the deceased, returns to the corpse. So the 35th day marks a critical moment in the process of revivification of the deceased. And we can understand this because in the first 35 days, that is the moment when the body was eviscerated, when all the internal organs were taken out, and also when the the body was dehydrated with natron salt to get all the fluids out of it. And so that's really a moment, a very in-between moment when the living Ba, the living spirit, is somewhere else, and it is in the 35th day that the living spirit comes back to the empty body to inhabit it again. Two funerary manuscripts, and I only show you here one. One is inscribed for the husband, and the other is inscribed for the wife, and they died only 2 weeks apart. And this one is for the wife. Beautiful, beautiful manuscript. They give additional information. The two passages, because what is interesting about these two manuscripts, they're basically identical. They say the same thing, but in different wording. And so we can compare particularly the issue about the 35th day. The two passages that I have translated here for you comment on the same event in the mummification procedure, but use slightly different wording. And by comparing the two passages, we can reconstruct what actually happened on the 35th day. So let's read it. The manuscript of the husband, it says, "May you," here the priest addresses the deceased, "may you emerge in a state of jubilation from the slaughtering room. 8 processions will be conducted for you up to your 36 days. And the 36th day is, of course, then the first day of the next period of 35 days. You will go to the fore. The ceremony of the great sea of Gonsu will be performed for you." Now let's read what is in the manuscript for the wife, slightly different. "The processions are appointed for their proper times. You will come forth in joy on the day of rowing." And I indicate with yellow that I think these two are the same. So 36 days and the day of rowing. "The ceremony of the great sea of Gonsu will be performed for you, all of your members going on board in the embalming pavilion." And so in the husband text it said, "You are leaving this room." In the wife's text it says, "You are going to this room." So in other words, on the 35th day, first the corpse was taken from the slaughtering room into the embalming pavilion, indicated in purple here. Second also, this day is called a day of rowing. That's in yellow. And third, on this day, this ceremony of the great sea of Gonsu will be performed, here indicated in green. In other words, and this is always the trick with Egyptian ritual text, you kind of have to translate it now, transform it back into what actually happened in reality. On the 35th day, the corpse is transported from the place where it was eviscerated and desiccated, that's the slaughtering room, to the place where it will be anointed and bandaged into a mummy, and that's the embalming pavilion. The transport of the corpse from one room to the next is conceived as a boat journey, a day of rowing, that takes place on the Great Sea of Gonsu. This Great Sea of Gonsu is a ritual space, conceived as a body of water, but in real life it must be the passageway between the slaughtering room and the embalming pavilion. The transport is thus ritualized as a boat journey across the Nile, from the east to the west, from the house to the tomb, from the land of the living to the land of the dead. Now we can better understand the opening label of the Artemis Papyrus. We are again. The Artemis Papyrus gives the ceremonies that were conducted on the 35th day when the eviscerated and desiccated corpse was transported to a new, clean room where it would be anointed and wrapped in mummy linen, to be buried eventually on the 70th day. The Artemis Papyrus preserves the transcript of the rituals of this day of rowing, as the 35th day is called in the two other funerary papyri. And indeed, the heading states that the transcript is in accordance with what is written in the ceremony of rowing the mummy. There we have a beautiful match, rowing and rowing. So this ceremony of rowing the mummy is otherwise unknown, but it must be the title of a ritual handbook that records the proceedings for the day of rowing. It must be similar to, if not identical with, the ceremony of the Great Sea of Gonsu that is mentioned in these two other papyri. The wording of the heading is, I believe, revealing. It does not label the manuscript as being the ceremony of rowing the mummy. No, it refers to the handbook as its authoritative source. It labels the current manuscript as a derivative of a more prestigious handbook. Even if this particular ritual handbook has not been preserved, we know that such handbooks recorded the rituals that were performed throughout the country in the state temples to revivify the god Osiris in the month of Goyak. And here we have Osiris, the god of the dead. The so-called Goyak festival commemorated the god Osiris, his death, his dismemberment, his reconstitution, and his revivification. Over a period of 2 weeks, priests produced an Osiris figurine out of clay in the form of a mummy of about 50 centimeters. It's about this size, which is a divine cubit. And you can find them in many museums, because quite a number of them have been preserved. So they produced it out of clay in the form of a mummy, often with seeds of grain inside. And the figurine was then watered, and the grain would sprout, a sign of new life. And we actually have them found in these things, as you can see here, these 50 centimeters little clay mummies of the god Osiris. They all are placed in their own little miniature coffin, and they were treated in these temples. And the figurine, when it had sprouted, was then mummified, as we can see here, and then transported to a temporary burial in the temple. The next year, it would be replaced by a new Osiris figurine, and the figurine of the previous year would then be buried in the cemetery. And those are the ones that we have found in archaeological excavations. This cycle of producing every year a new grain mummy would ensure Osiris' continuous revivification. Now, Osiris represents or even embodies Egypt. So his revivification brought about fertility and prosperity for the entire country, as indicated here with the sprouting grain and the erect penis. The god's revivification ensured a successful agricultural season for Egypt. And so this was a quintessential, a critical ceremony for Egyptian culture. By referencing the ceremony of rowing the mummy as the source text, the heading reveals that the ritual of the Artemis Papyrus is in fact an adaptation of a temple ritual that was originally performed for Osiris as part of the Goyak festival. In other words, the Artemis Papyrus is not an original composition. It is a temple ritual appropriated for a private individual. Artemis burial was modeled after an Osiris ritual. This insight helps to explain the reference to the mummification hall of Apis Osiris. Apis Osiris is the local form of the god Osiris in Memphis, the ancient capital of Egypt, more or less where Cairo is nowadays, and the location of the famous Serapeum. Osiris Apis, Serapeum. The authoritative source text may originally well have been used in the Goyak rituals of Apis Osiris in Memphis. Well, now it is time to turn our attention to the ritual proceedings. What was done for Artemis on the 35th day of her mummification? The manuscript does not give a straightforward description of the actions carried out. In fact, no Egyptian manuscript does, unfortunately. It consists primarily of traditional incantations that priests had to recite in the course of the ritual. Most of these incantations are already known from other sources. In this regard, the manuscript is a patchwork of incantations selected from a variety of sources. What is quite unique, however, is the way the scribe brought order and structure to the flow of information. Thanks to his clear and consistent method, the manuscript can be read with some ingenuity as a linear and coherent script of the ritual proceedings from beginning to end. What is then this scribal method? His first method is spacing. As we can see in this section, the scribe employed vertical spacing to create 4 discrete paragraphs of unequal length. I hope you can see this really is a block of text, little space here, another block of text, etc. His second method is alternating the use of demotic and hieratic script. And that's what first drew my interest and my attention. As I mentioned before, demotic records vernacular Egyptian and hieratic records classical Egyptian. Here I have translated for you the first paragraph or episode of this particular section. I have split the demotic and the classical Egyptian / the hieratic into 2 columns for the sake of clarity, but note that in the manuscript we have running text. This just continues as such. There is no break, as it were, between the hieratic and the demotic, which shows me that the scribe who inscribed the manuscript knew both scripts equally well. As you can see, the demotic text is reserved for the practical instructions, whereas the hieratic gives us the incantations, the words that are to be said with every action. There's a clear specialization of scripts here. And the third method is the use of an abbreviation marker, etc., to truncate an incantation, as we have it here. And so we start with the scribe of the god's book performs the opening of the mouth to the god. The god is a normal reference to a mummy, the mummy being Osiris in essence, irrespective of which individual it is, as the mummy rests under the canopy of cedar wood. And then when he finishes with the opening of the mouth ritual, this priest recites the writings of making the god enter. And then we get, in hieratic, the incantation. And then, O Horus children, Amset. And then we get this funny sign over there. It took me quite a while to figure out how to decipher this, what it is. But it must mean etc. And he used it a few times. For example, in this particular case, the scribe wrote only the first 2 words of incantation 73 of the so-called opening of the mouth ritual, which I give you here in translation. Instead of giving the entire incantation, which amounts to several lines, as you can see here, he indicated with the abbreviation marker that the ritualist should supply the missing words from memory or read from a handbook. Throughout the manuscript, well-known incantations are abbreviated or significantly reduced in length. This gives the manuscript a bit of a makeshift character, or to put it in more positive terms, the scribe was quite an innovator. If we use these 3 scribal methods to recover the intended structure of the text, we arrive at a logical sequence of rituals performed at 4 successive locations: the wabet, or mummification hall, then we go to a tent, presumably then we go to a lake, and eventually we go to a structure called the West, as I indicate here. This is where the middle part is, the missing middle part. So these are dotted lines. I don't know what exactly happens there. So this means that the corpse, which, remember, by day 35 has been eviscerated and desiccated, is transported from the wabet via a short stop at a tent and a lake to a location called the West, where the corpse will be anointed and bandaged into a mummy. At each location, a set of rituals are performed and incantations are recited. And I've listed them here below the respective locations. Through these rituals and incantations, I apologize. Sorry, that was my Dropbox. It should not have. Yes. Through these rites and incantations, Artemis is identified with the god Osiris, the god who was wrongfully killed by his brother Seth, but eventually vindicated by his eldest son Horus and revivified by his wife Isis. Through this ritual identification with Osiris, Artemis will overcome death like Osiris. In summary, the ritual starts at the wabet, where the deceased is, as it were, woken up from the slumber of death by means of an incantation and a mouth-opening ritual. The living spirit can thus reunite with its body. This is how it starts. This reunification completes the first stage of mummification, the evisceration and the desiccation of the corpse, and marks the transition to the next stage of anointing and bandaging. The priest invokes the presence of the spirit by reciting the so-called Sokar litany. This litany of 42 epithets addressed to the funerary god Sokar is excerpted from a much longer temple liturgy, which is attested for almost 2,000 years before Artemis died. This is a very, very old text. And so Again, it's not when the god rests under the canopy, when the mummy is under the canopy of cedar wood in the wabed, the scribe of the god's book, that is the priest, will recite the ceremony of taking Sokar out of the shrine. And then it has these very old, age-old epithets. Oh, who was crowned coming forth from the womb. These are all references to creator gods. O eldest son of the first primeval one. O Lord of faces and many of forms, etc., etc. Very often these litanies are not very informative when it comes to explaining what they really are about. They're all lofty epithets. The corpse is then transported to a tent, where a curse ritual is performed. In Egyptian religion, death is framed as murder, as the murder of the god Osiris by his brother Seth. And therefore, to achieve continued existence in the afterlife, the murderer has to be punished for his crime first. Following the curse ritual, the corpse is put inside a ceremonial bark, which I show you here in an image from the Book of the Dead. It's just so that we can envision what happens. To facilitate transport. Now a priest takes on the role of the goddess Isis, the widow of the god Osiris. And she, or he, because the priest was a male, laments the imminent departure of her husband for the land of the dead. And that is also depicted in the Book of the Dead vignette. Next, another priest serves as the eldest son Horus and reassures his father Osiris that he has vindicated his father's wrongful death. And again, that is basically what happens with this person here. Unfortunately, at this point, the Louvre part of the manuscript breaks off. The rites that immediately follow are therefore unknown. Irrespective, it is clear that the corpse will eventually leave the tent, being transported in its ceremonial bark. We pick up the ritual again with the Vienna sheet of the manuscript. This is where we find the text of the rite of rowing. Remember, the 35th day is after all the day of rowing. We have here two narrow columns of 48 lines that are paired. So here we have these two narrow columns, but this line goes with this goes with this. It's a beautiful list. For each line, the name of a deity is paired with the name of a ceremonial bark. So, for example, the god Sokar, with his epithet Lord of the Mountains, apparently he has a bark that is called Reed Float of the Falcon. I mean, it's not as if we really know anything about these bark names, but there we go. Tatenan, a god from Memphis, a greater god, father of the gods, great god. He has apparently a bark that is called bark that lifts up the gods. Herishef, his bark is named Re, is jubilant, etc., etc. The list is preceded by a vertical line of text, also in hieratic. You can see it here. That says, Horus goes round and round in his bark. Horus being the son of the god Osiris. Well, this opening line is important because it belongs in fact to a temple liturgy for a navigation rite on the temple lake. One version of this temple liturgy is preserved in the beautiful temple of the goddess Hathor in Dendera, probably, at least in my opinion, the most beautiful temple in Egypt. Next to the temple building proper, so here, lies the artificial temple lake. I hope you can see that here. No water nowadays, only palm trees, but this was the temple lake, where the priest collected the water for their rituals of purification and washing. And next to it is a small, used to be a small chapel, a small bark sanctuary. Well, inside the door jambs of this chapel are preserved, so here, and also on the other side, are preserved two scenes. I only show you one, because they're identical, basically. And they list the deities that participate in the navigation ritual. Like the Artemis papyrus, here we have it in hieroglyphs, the list starts with the verse, Horus goes round and round in his bark. Horus in his Pecher, Sepsen, Her, Em, Via, F. Horus goes round and round in his bark. And we have the exact same thing. And then the names of the deities are listed in these vertical columns, as in the manuscript. We have these beautiful, all these deities listed over there. And so this bark sanctuary was used to house the statue of the goddess Hathor when she came out of her temple building and when the navigation ritual was conducted on the adjacent temple lake. And such navigation rites consisted of putting out on the temple lake a flotilla of miniature barks, one for each participating deity. And in the case of the Dendera temple, the navigation rite was performed to cool the rage of the goddess by means of a refreshing journey on the temple lake. In the funerary ritual of the Artemis papyrus, however, the same ritual is used for a very different purpose. Here the ritual symbolizes the crossing of the Nile, the transition from the land of the living on the east bank of the Nile to the land of the dead on the west bank of the Nile. It serves the same function, I would argue, as the ceremony of the Great Sea of Khonsu, which is mentioned in the two funerary manuscripts that I just mentioned. It frames the transport of the corpse from the slaughtering room to the embalming pavilion as a boat journey. In reality, there was probably no water involved. All that was done was a priest reciting this list of deities and their barks, while other priests carried in the meantime the corpse to the other room. Well, following the navigation ritual, offerings are presented to the mummy and a series of glorifications are recited. And finally then, the god is taken to a structure that is called the West. The instructions on how to do this are given in the Demotic, and they deserve our attention. Let's read them. It says the god, again, that is the mummy, the corpse, should be entered into the first location of the West. The West is this structure. While the mummy, its head is to the north and its feet are to the south. Rites of libation and censing should then be performed. Then the god, the mummy, should be entered into the second location, while its head is to the west and its feet are to the east. Then the mummy should be entered into the third location, while its head, and then by accident the scribe wrote its head twice, so that's why I crossed this one out, is to the east and his feet are to the west. The god should be entered now into the fourth location, while his head is to the north and his feet are to the south. What is going on here? And there is no parallel for this, so we just have to use our cunning to figure out what's going on here. Well, I think these instructions make best sense if we envisage the West as a set of rooms consisting of a vestibule, which is the first location, that has its entrance on its south side. A side chamber to its east and west, those are the second and the third locations, and a further room to its north, which is the fourth location. The ritual can then be reconstructed and understood as follows. Here we have the mummy. I took a picture of a mummy that's more or less contemporary with the Artemis papyrus. Priests enter the west, this building, from the south, walking northward through the entrance into the vestibule, while carrying the mummy horizontally and headlong. So its head is oriented to the north and its feet to the south, as the instructions prescribe. Inside the vestibule, they rest the mummy and perform the purification ritual with water and incense. In my view, this illustration marks the transition from the profane world of the living, the outside, to the sacred realm of the West, the inside. The priests then turn the mummy 90 degrees counterclockwise and carry it into the western side chamber. Next, the priests turn the mummy fully around, carry it across the central room, and bring it into the eastern side chamber. To complete the procedure, the priests turn the mummy around again, return to the central room, and then return to the center and take a right into the northern chamber, thus carrying the mummy with its head to the north and its feet to the south into the fourth and final location. It is in this northern room that the corpse will remain for the next 35 days, to be anointed and wrapped in linen so as to become a proper mummy. And that also explains why the mummy is not turned yet another time around, because then we would have had all corners of the cardinal directions of the... but no, it stays here. It's not leaving. And I would argue that what we have here is actually also a symbolic movement that mimics the setting and rising of the sun, which was also considered to be a process of regeneration in ancient Egypt. So that when we go inside, we go to the west where the sun sets in the evening, then we go to the east through the underworld, and then we rise in the morning in the east and we go to the north. So it is also a regeneration ritual through its movements. So what is to be done now in this northern room over the next 35 days is described in another handbook, the so-called embalming ritual, which luckily has been preserved in 3 copies. But that is the topic for another talk. Now, the specificity of these final instructions make me think that we are dealing yet again with a rite that is appropriated from a temple ritual. I suggest that we return for a moment to the temple of Hathor in Dendera. On the roof of this beautiful temple, there are 2 chapels that were used for the rituals of this Goyak festival. And here you see the entrance to one of them, and note that everything is covered with images and texts that describe these rituals that were performed there. The Eastern Chapel, so now we see the roof. We're on the roof, here's the east and the west. This is, if anybody has anybody been to this beautiful temple? Anybody been to Egypt? It's always on the trajectory of people going to Egypt. This is where you come up on the roof, for those who have been there. Well, the Eastern Chapel, is the location where the Osiris figurine was manufactured from clay and watered until it sprouted. The backroom of this chapel is called the Wabet, which is the same name used in the Artemis Papyrus for the location where we start the ritual. In the Western Chapel, so here we have, just to remind you of the Goyak festival and the Osiris figurine. In the Western Chapel, the figurine was mummified and buried for 1 year until it was replaced by the figurine of the next year. The back room of the Western Chapel is called Ib. And I'll leave that untranslated, because I don't know how to translate it. Written along the ceiling of this Ib room is a text that describes, I believe, the very same ritual that is preserved in the Artemis Papyrus. In this case, the ritual is not performed for a private individual like Artemis, but for the Osiris figurine, for Osiris himself. The text can be broken down into a heading and 5 episodes, and let's go over them, because it's really interesting. So the heading says, on this beautiful day, it's a day of rowing in a sense, the powerful and the noble lady, Isis, the widow, the wife of Osiris, is in a festive mood. Her son Horus is in joy, because all the rituals of burial are to be done for this noble god, Osiris. Again, in reality, the Osiris figurine. In his perfect festival of equipping his body. So here we have yet another name for this 35th day. It's the festival of equipping his body, namely the anointing and the bandaging that's going to start now. So this is the heading. And now is described what actually happens in, again, somewhat obscure language. But with some ingenuity we can figure it out. It says, coming by the overseer of secrets and the god's priest. That is basically the same priest as is mentioned in the Artemis Papyrus. He comes. And he opens the opening of the face, so he does basically this invocation ritual of this noble god of the mummy in his shrine, Osiris. So that is the invocation. The second episode then is, then this great god, the mummy, is entered on their shoulders by these priests, by the sons of Horus, whose name amounts to 9 gods. So we have these 9 priests who identify with the sons of Horus, and they carry the mummy out of the Wabet. So this is the leaving. The third episode is now making him unite with his father Rehorachte, that is the sun. Rehorachte is the sun god. And so his face is perfect, the mummy's face is perfect when the sun disk rises on the perfect transfiguration spells and the incantations of joining with his father. So priests are reciting these incantation spells in the early morning as the sun is rising and when the solar rays fall on the Osiris figurine. And through these solar rays, the Osiris figurine is of course enlivened. So that's what we call uniting with the disk. Not described in the Artemis papyrus, maybe in the middle piece. And now we get to 4, the arrival at the Eep. It says, and going with him to the Eep, letting this god rest, letting the mummy rest upon the alabaster bed. So there's somewhere a bed in this room. The mummy's face turned to the sky, his head to the north, his feet to the south. Isn't that beautiful? That's what we have in the Artemis papyrus. What happens then? He's purified with incense and cool water. That's what we also have in the Artemis papyrus. And then it explains, then all his limbs are bandaged by the great priest of this house. Then these ointment jars are brought before the mummy and anointing the body with all the unguents at their proper place. This happens then, of course, in the next 35 days before the burial, which is an anointing and bandaging. This is really interesting because these 5 episodes can be situated in the architecture of the roof chapels of the Dendera temple, and I try to indicate it here. Episode 1, the invocation, happens here in the Wabed. The leaving then is going out. So what happened in reality is that the priests carried the Osiris figurine across the room from the Wabed, where it was manufactured, to the Eep, where it was to be mummified and buried. That's what they did. And they've made a stop in this kiosk here. That's where they did the uniting with the sun disk. That's why it doesn't have a roof, this kiosk, because the sun rays have to go in. And then they walked into this chapel, which is called the Eep. Now, the doorposts of both the eastern and the western chapel are inscribed with the Sokar litany, the exact same litany that is used at the start of the Artemis papyrus to invoke the spirit of the deceased. That cannot be a coincidence. Ostensibly, priests recited the Sokar litany as they exited the eastern chapel and recited it again as they entered the western chapel. Now, how the figurine is installed in the back room, or the Eep, is not explicated in the text we just read. But notice those niches in the side walls of the vestibule. That's why I stopped my red line exactly there. These allow for the peculiar movement that is described in the Artemis papyrus. If we go to the east, to the west, then we turn back to the east, remember, then we go back to the middle, and we go to the north. This interpretation, now if this is correct, then what is called the Eep inside the western chapel on the temple roof is called the 4th location inside the structure called the west in the Artemis papyrus. This interpretation may be corroborated by a passage in the Artemis papyrus that prescribes that the corpse is to be brought to a structure called Eep. But that's with a P and not with a B. So could Ip with P be a vernacular form of the more formal Ib with a B? Could a voiced plosive B develop into a voiceless plosive P over time? Well, that is the question. And I'm not sure if you want to go into phonology with me, but let's do it another time. But if this identification is correct, then the ritual, as verbally described in the Artemis papyrus, finds its translation in stone architecture in the Osiris chapels on the roof of the temple of Hathor in Dendera. Well, I have taken you on a wild ride through a maze of obscure texts and rituals. Let's conclude. I hope to have conveyed that the Artemis papyrus preserves the script for an elaborate ritual that is to be performed on the 35th day of the mummification process, on the day that the corpse is transferred from the room where it was eviscerated and desiccated to another clean room where it will be anointed and wrapped in linen and thus turned into a mummy. This transport from one room to the next is conceived by means of the various incantations as a boat journey, a day of rowing, and embedded in the mythology of the god Osiris, the god of death and regeneration. The manuscript is a remarkable document because of its use of vernacular demotic and formal hieratic side by side, and because of its makeshift character. It really stands out among our corpus of ritual texts. It is made up of incantations excerpted from temple liturgies, and these temple liturgies are here repurposed for private use. In this regard, the manuscript documents an important development in Egyptian scribal culture in the Hellenistic and Roman period. While Egypt was ruled by Greek kings and then Roman emperors, Egyptian priests and scribes engaged in many creative ways with their cultural heritage and scribal culture. Ancient texts and rituals were reused and repurposed in innovative ways, as in the Artemis Papyrus. The final centuries of pharaonic culture before the arrival of Christianity witnessed an outburst of scribal creativity. And this is a story that remains to be told. And I thank you for your attention.
We have just a few moments for questions.
I'll be happy to.
Yes, please.
Yes.
So it's a very elaborate process here. How often would this be done? What stature did the person have to have in the community to be accorded this treatment? So because I'm thinking there's probably only one mummy going into the temple at a time. Yeah, there's more than.
Yeah. Well, I actually think that very little was actually done for Artemis. What was done was that the manuscript was recited. And through the recitation of the words, these rituals were, as it were, performed. So, and it might also be explain a little bit why the manuscript is written so hastily. The hieratic and also the demotic are not of particularly good quality. I mean, the scribe clearly did not take time and effort to produce a beautiful, almost calligraphic manuscript. As, for example, the other manuscript that I showed you of the husband and wife. That is beautiful. So of a different nature. And so actually, I don't think that she did get this burial as elaborate as it is, as I have reconstructed it. It's completely, I mean, imaginative in a sense. But therefore, still effective in the Egyptian mind, absolutely. And the fact she was buried with it, we may assume that the roll was found with her mummy, although even if the mummy, as far as I know, is nowhere. Maybe it already disintegrated. It being present on her body made that she could go through the ritual again and again and again. Yeah. For the Osiris figurine, this was indeed done. But this was, of course, state-sponsored, and so the resources were available to do this every year. Yeah.
Was there evidence that the actual body was taken through the roof as opposed to the clay figurine?
Okay, I didn't hear it.
Was there evidence that the actual body went through the process as opposed to the clay figurine acting as a proxy?
If they did this with a real body? I mean, they certainly did mummification and burial rituals with real bodies. And this particular case, this was what I tried to reconstruct with the Goyak festival. This was really only done with these clay figurines of 50 centimeters. And yeah, they anointed these figurines, they clothed them, they treated them as, nowadays also still done in Catholic churches with certain statues of saints and things like that. So yeah, and they took them out and they paraded them around the town and they put them on the lake on a boat, and yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I was wondering if you had any ideas of the relationship between a Greek name and the Egyptian ritual. Does that imply she was married to an Egyptian, or what's your explanation of that combination?
Yeah, exactly. This is one of those beautiful cases where we see these two cultures coming together. And in Hellenistic period, this is where this starts, that indeed Egyptians adopt a Greek name for very practical purposes to go ahead in life, in a sense. If they wanted to work in the Greek administration, they had to know, first of all, of course, the Greek language, but it was also very helpful to adopt a Greek name. And so then we get these individuals who have two names, a Greek name and an Egyptian name. And some that are very difficult then to identify in the sources, because in a Greek document we only find the Greek name, in an Egyptian document we only find the Egyptian name. We would never know that the two match and they're the same individual. But in certain cases we have bilingual documents, and then we can make the match. And so we know about this phenomenon, we're well informed about it. Now in the Roman period this continues, and then we also see that people simply have a Greek name and probably are indeed living their lives as Greeks, even if they are, you know, in the Egyptian countryside, and they do not even then adopt an Egyptian name in an Egyptian context, as they would have done in the Hellenistic period. And so the case with Artemis, if she had had an Egyptian name, it would be in the Egyptian document, because it's so much easier to write an Egyptian name in the hieratic and the demotic script. It's actually quite, it's not complicated, but it requires some extra effort to write a Greek name in the demotic script. And so they did. So that tells me that she really had only one name. Now the question, of course, what is her ethnicity? Does that mean that she was Greek? That we cannot tell. It is very likely that in the Roman period, the majority of people in the south of Egypt who wore Greek names were this class of Greco-Egyptians. Some of them indeed might have descended from Greek settlers in the Hellenistic period. Others were kind of, you know, married into that class, and we have so many generations already. What Artemis spoke at home? Did she speak Greek? Did she speak Egyptian? I wouldn't even know. Yeah, this is a very interesting hybrid culture. Yes.
First, I want to thank you for an absolutely brilliant decipherment of this extremely complicated text and all its implications.
Well, thank you.
It's very beautiful and greatly appreciated. The whole business reminds me, I don't want to divert too much from your own theme, but it reminds me a lot of these golden masks that were found in Mycenaean burials.
Mm-hmm.
The deceased was, face of the deceased was covered with a golden, thin golden sheet that mimicked the features of his face. And attached to the chest was a tablet, also in gold. And this was inscribed in the most long and complicated text, which consists of advice to the deceased as to the route he must follow in order to reach to the immortality.
Yes.
Very complicated. You have to take a right turn here and make a left turn there.
Don't drink of the first spring. Yes.
Very little. There was a way you could get to the other world, so to speak. And I just wonder whether there, I don't know, could you comment on that a little bit? I don't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And we actually have a similar text from ancient Egypt. Those are these books of the dead that do include indeed information for the deceased, where to go, where not to go. That's more important, where not to go, and what to say to demons, and how to avert misfortune over there. This is a very different type of text. This really gives us the ritual that was done in the process of mummification. And so this is not information for the deceased, this is actually information for the priests, because they have to recite these things. And so that is a shift in the Greco-Roman period, in the Egyptian scribal culture, that they also start to give these kinds of texts that are in principle housed in the temple library. They now also give them with the deceased. And it replaces, in fact, those books of the dead, which is a very interesting development as well. Yes. Thank you.
All right, please join me. I'm really delighted for this talk, and please help me congratulate Jacco Dieleman.
Thank you. Thank you very much.